Earlier this year, Rishi Sunak promised new guidance for how schools should respond to the growing number of trans children in the British education system. Although the guidance was never published, we do know from leaked sources what the guidance was going to advise. It was going to advise that schools must tell parents as soon as a child identifies as trans, even without the child's consent. It was also going to advise that a child would need consent from parents and potentially from a doctor before being allowed to socially transition at school. By the way, a social transition means somebody living in the role of their chosen gender and changing their names, pronouns, and appearance as a result. It was also going to advise that trans children must use the changing rooms and toilets that reflect their biological sex at birth, and it was going to advise that trans girls cannot participate in competitive sports. By the way, these leaks were published by credible sources such as The Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. I've not just plucked this off some random website. So why wasn't the guidance published? Well, because these suggestions are illegal. In the UK, there's something called the Equalities Act, which states that schools and employers cannot discriminate, harass, or victimize somebody based on their protected characteristics. Protected characteristics are things such as race, gender, sexuality, religion, disability, etc. Refusing to use someone's chosen name or their chosen pronouns is a form of discrimination and is therefore illegal under the Equalities Act. And it's widely speculated that the reason Sunak never published the guidance was because it clashed with the Equalities Act and was therefore illegal. But not only was the guidance illegal, in my opinion and in my experience as a teacher in British education, it's also very bad advice. And it's bad advice because it's not designed to support or protect trans children. It's designed to satisfy parents and Tory voters. And if this advice does eventually get published, it will endanger and further discriminate against trans children. So let's go through the advice individually and we can explore what impact this advice is likely to have on trans children. But before we go on, I just want to give a quick content warning because we are going to be talking about the very grim topic of transphobia. So if this is something you find triggering, or if you're having a bad mental health day, maybe come back to this video another time. Also, I just want to make it really clear that I'm not an expert on trans issues. I have been a teacher over the last couple of years, and I have seen the impact that transphobia has on education, but I'm not an authority on trans issues and I'm not trying to position myself as one. So Sunak's first piece of advice was that schools should tell parents as soon as a child begins to socially transition at school, even without the child's consent. This is a very common dilemma facing schools at the moment because often trans children will come out at school first and will try to hide it from their parents. And this puts schools in a very difficult and uncomfortable position where they need to decide whether they should tell the parents that their child is trans. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, said the following: "We think parental consent is really very important in this. A lot of parents have been worried about this, and we do think it's important that parents are involved in the discussion." On the surface, that sounds very sensible. Transparency is always good, right? Especially in schools. But there are also trans kids out there whose parents are not supportive towards trans issues. These parents might react negatively to the news that their child is trans and might even behave in a hostile manner towards the child. So by creating a blanket rule where schools must tell parents every time a child comes out as trans, with or without the child's consent, is actually a very dangerous suggestion because without a doubt, it will expose some trans children to danger. 44% of trans people said they avoided being open about their gender identity at home for fear of a negative reaction. 27% said they experienced verbal harassment at home, and 5% said they experienced physical violence at home. In all cases, the most frequent perpetrator was the parents. So outing trans kids to their parents, in some cases, is a very dangerous thing to do. Sunak's next piece of advice was that a trans child would need consent from parents and potentially a doctor before being allowed to socially transition at school. Trans children who are supported by their families and who are allowed to transition socially experience a 71% decrease in severe depression and a 65% decrease in unalive attempts. Statistics like these show how important it is that we support trans kids and allow them to be themselves, because this is about child safety. And requiring doctors' permission to socially transition is also referred to as medical gatekeeping. Historically, medical gatekeeping has led to discrimination against non-white trans people and neurodiverse trans people. It's also led to invasive examinations, unnecessary hurdles, and the unfair application of requirement criteria before being allowed to transition. And I just don't think any of that would be good for trans children. Sunak's next piece of advice was that trans pupils cannot use the toilets or changing rooms they feel most comfortable using. Forcing a trans child to use a toilet which doesn't match their gender identity is a very cruel and potentially dangerous thing to do. I understand that schools probably won't allow trans children to use the same changing rooms as their cisgendered peers, and schools would probably argue that this is for safeguarding reasons. Personally, I think the best thing to do would be to have separate, private changing rooms for students who don't identify as either male or female. They could also be used by any student that just doesn't feel safe using the communal changing rooms. And the same for toilets. Schools could have unisex toilets for students who don't feel comfortable using the gendered toilets. And Sunak's advice also contained the suggestion that trans girls should not take part in competitive sports. Schools have a duty towards being inclusive and to allow every student the opportunity to thrive. Excluding an already marginalised group from participating in sports is going to other trans kids even further. And to ban trans kids from sports really misses the point of why school sports exists in the first place. It's designed to foster teamwork, to build character, and to keep kids active. So excluding trans kids from all these benefits feels incredibly hypocritical and unnecessary. So as I said at the beginning of this video, this advice is not designed to support trans children. It's designed to satisfy Tory voters who, dare I say it, don't like trans people. At the Tory conference earlier this year, Rishi Sunak said the following: "We shouldn't be bullied into believing people can be any sex they want to be. A man is a man and a woman is a woman." It's interesting that Sunak described trans people as being bullies, because that's not the reality in British schools. 64% of trans school children reported being bullied for their gender identity, and 13% of trans school children reported experiencing physical violence as part of that bullying. In my last video, I talked about bullying, and I talked about how bullying is a group dynamic, and alongside the bully is a group called reinforcers. Reinforcers are people who support and reinforce the behaviour of the bully, either by smiling, laughing, or making supportive comments towards the bully whilst the bully is bullying. Basically, they validate the bully's behaviour. So when Sunak made those comments at the Tory party conference, Sunak made himself into a reinforcer for anyone who wants to do some transphobic bullying. These comments alone will have caused a rise in transphobic bullying in schools. So clearly this is not a man who cares about trans kids or their safety. But I don't just like to highlight problems in my videos. I also want to offer some kind of solution or something. So I was thinking, what advice could Sunak publish if he really wanted to support trans kids and keep them safe in school? Myself as one, but using my experience as a teacher and as someone who has seen how transphobia affects education, here are some of my suggestions. Sunak could start by calming the moral panic by acknowledging that trans people exist and not describing them as bullies. That would be a great start. He could also recommend that schools teach a book written by a trans author, or learn about an artist who's trans, or learn about some LGBTQ history in history class. Sunak could acknowledge that it's not always a good idea to reveal a trans child's gender identity to their parents, and perhaps he could create some sort of service that supports and informs the parents of trans children and also supports trans kids who don't have supportive parents. I don't know what that service would look like, but it seems like something this country needs. Schools could invite expert organisations to come in and to talk to children about gender diversity. Those very same organisations could come in and train staff in how to create a trans-inclusive environment. Sunak could encourage schools to hire more trans staff, and Sunak could also encourage schools to build unisex toilets and private changing rooms for students who don't feel comfortable using gendered spaces. So that's what Sunak could do, in my opinion, if he really wanted to support trans kids. But what could we do? Like, what can me and you do to help improve this situation? We could email our MPs and tell them we disagree with the proposed trans guidance for schools. And this is actually really easy to do if you go onto the Mermaids website. Mermaids is the UK's largest trans charity, and they have a section on their homepage called Ask the Government to Protect Trans Young People in Schools. It's a really big button right at the front of their homepage. If you press that button, it takes you to a page which makes it super easy to write to your local MP about this exact issue, and they even have a pre-written statement you can use. If you're a parent, Mermaids also has a great page on their website about how you can support trans children. I really recommend you give that a read. And finally, I really recommend you read this book. It's called The Transgender Issue by Sean Fay. I learnt a lot about trans politics by reading this book, and some of the information which I have shared in this video comes from this book. So if you want to learn more about trans politics and trans issues, I definitely recommend that book. Like I said, I'm not an expert and I don't have all the answers, but those are some suggestions I have given my experience. I probably missed loads of really, really good ideas, so if you can think of any other suggestions, either things that Rishi Sunak could do or things that we could do to help support trans children, please put them in the comments. Actually, I'm a bit worried about what's going to be posted in the comments under this video, so some nice, wholesome, good comments would be really appreciated. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll be back soon.